All neurological activity is the result of neurons firing in the brain, nerve cells, that communicate mostly by chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. It's these neurotransmitters that hold the key to understanding what drugs do to the brain, because every single drug of abuse mimics the activities of naturally occurring neurotransmitters in the brain. These drugs will either increase or decrease what's already going on in the brain, causing changes not only to the cells and the chemistry of that brain, but also to the neuroplasticity and evolving shape and structure of that brain. In addition to the cell body, where the nucleus contains DNA that changes the cell depending upon how it's fired and activated, the cell has a long transmitting cable, sometimes many of these, called axons. The axon ends in a little bulb that's called the synapse. And this is where neurotransmitters are stored in synaptic vesicles. These vesicles actually contain whatever neurotransmitter, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, a number of different neurochemicals that can be held in the particular axon synapse. They're transmitted across to the receiving end of another cell. These receivers are called dendrites. And so you have the dendrite of one cell, or many dendrites of one cell, coming into contact with the axon or axon termini of another cell or many other cells. This all creates the possibility of neurotransmission. All we have to have now is something that excites that nerve to entice it to release the neurotransmitters to communicate with the other nerves downstream. While there are hundreds of different kinds of neurochemicals in the brain, there are 8 basic neuroreceptor and neurochemical types that are the most important in understanding the action and effects of drugs in the brain when it comes to addiction. Glutamate is the main excitatory chemical of the brain. It turns the brain on, speeds things up, makes you think. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the main inhibitory chemical of the brain. It turns things off. It slows cells down. It deregulates certain parts of the brain. Dopamine has been called the main pleasure chemical of the brain. It runs the pleasure, motivational reward circuits of the brain, as well as the automatic behavioral sections of the brain. Norepinephrine, it's an excitatory chemical. It turns on different areas of the brain. Serotonin slows them down. The opioids slow them down. Acetylcholine spins them up. And endocannabinoids, the same chemicals that are in marijuana, actually slow down different parts of the brain. So this is the general lay of the land of the neurotransmitters that we'll talk about in this section. In this particular slide, we can see the release of a neurotransmitter from the axon going across the synaptic cleft and binding to the receptor molecules on a dendrite. There will be an action downstream we'll talk about later, but once this action has occurred, the molecule releases itself from that receptor and is taken to a reuptake mechanism, a transporter that takes it back into the axon cell and recycles it for further use. So we can see that this is the first step in normal neurotransmission. And here we can see the effects of cocaine in that particular neurotransmission. The cocaine binds to the receptor molecule and then prohibits the dopamine from being returned to the presynaptic transport axon, and then it stays out into the cleft a little bit longer and continues to stimulate things downstream and have more of an effect. And finally, what we see here is that once the neurotransmitter has bound to the receptor molecule. The purple image there is a G protein, which binds to that receptor molecule and then causes the release of an enzyme. In this case, it's called cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP, which starts a second messenger cascade, a third messenger, fourth messenger, all the way into the genetics of the cell. And the more of this that happens, then the more the cell actually modifies itself to receive more input along these lines. And this is called the long-term potentiation and neuroplasticity. On this slide, we can see, again, GABA and glutamate, the two major chemicals in the brain. Glutamate being the brain chemical that excites the brain, and GABA being the one that inhibits the brain, turns things off. GABA, of course, is more present at night when you're asleep. Glutamate's more present during the day when you're awake. Good example, alcohol increases GABA, decreases glutamate, so it sedates the brain. We can see how those things sort of work, and I'll explain it more as we talk about different drugs and how they affect the brain. But you can see on the slide on the left that GABA pretty much is the projections of GABA neurons are almost all through the brain. On the right, you can see the glutamate activates mostly in the prefrontal and frontal areas of the brain, although it does go globally throughout the brain. But these are some major pathways that are very, very important for regulating emotions and cognitive activity. These will all be turned off a lot during drug abuse. In this slide, we can see the dopamine projections through the brain, the major pathways where dopamine is released. Dopamine's most often called the reward chemical. It's involved in stimulating the areas of the brain that create automatic behavioral seeking, and also involved in motor activities and movement. On the top, we see the nigrostriatal pathway. It goes from the substantia nigra to the striatum. That's associated with automatic motor movements, and a deficiency there causes Parkinson's disease. The second one is the one that goes from the tegmentum into the thalamus, controlling a lot of motor behavior and switching. The third one down is the mesolimbic pathway. This is the pleasure pathway that's so often talked about. It goes from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA at the bottom there, on up to the nucleus accumbens, which is the bottom part of the striatum, and it's the behavioral seeking reward part of the brain. So that particular connection between the VTA, ventral tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens, that connection is the pleasure pathway. And then finally we have the mesocortical pathway, which goes from the tegmentum into the brainstem into the prefrontal areas of the brain. And that particular area then activates cognition and craving and reward seeking and figuring out how to do something. If it's overstimulated, it pretty much just shuts down the frontal areas of the brain, though, that and norepinephrine. And then finally, we have the tuberoinfundibular pathway, and the tuberoinfundibular pathway goes from the hypothalamus into the and actually controls the release of hormones into the body, including prolactin, which is involved in behavior related to mammals nursing. In this particular slide, we're looking at the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which is otherwise known as the pleasure pathway. The blue line on that diagram on the left and on the right refers to dopamine neurons. The red has to do with glutamate. So dopamine is actually activated by and activating glutamate activity in the nucleus accumbens, and also glutamate into the frontal areas of the brain. This is oftentimes seen in the schizophrenic patients when there's overactivation of this mesolimbic pathway. We start seeing symptoms, the positive symptoms of psychosis. This is high aggression, propensity for violence, delusional behaviors, all of the manic behaviors associated with psychosis are part of this. Now, it's worthy of note that methamphetamine is one of the drugs, amphetamines, can cause this to happen for drug abusers as well. So it's not uncommon to find methamphetamine abusers with overactive areas in the mesolimbic pathway leading to the positive symptoms of psychosis. This is oftentimes called meth psychosis. In this slide, we can see the mesocortical dopamine pathway, and if we have low dopamine levels in that particular pathway going from the ventral tegmental area all the way through the limbic areas of the brain into the frontal cortical areas where we have more of our thoughts and skilled and voluntary behaviors. When we see a low level of dopamine there, we see negative symptoms of psychosis. In this particular mental illness, what we find is people tend to withdraw. They tend to have very depressed, negative, suicidal type feelings. They are very, very shy and very anhedonic, away from having any sense of pleasure or reward in life. These are also the manic part with the mesolimbic pathway we saw a moment ago, and the mesocortical. As they oscillate, we can see bipolar disorder, overactivity and underactivity in these areas also is associated with schizophrenia. You can tell that the blue pathways that you see in both of these diagrams are dopamine, but they are activated by an effect glutamate, which is the excitatory chemical, most exciting chemical in the brain, and that activates that area of the frontal areas or doesn't activate it, as the case would be here in this particular slide. So glutamate and dopamine and all these other neurotransmitters work together in sequence and constitute certain types of behavior, either more or less of certain activities of the brain. Norepinephrine is another neurotransmitter that's very important to what we're looking at here, and it's the chemical, the brain chemical that's associated with attention, concentration, working memory, how fast we process information, whether we're in a positive, upbeat mood or a negative mood, a lot of psychomotor activities. It's one of the gas pedals, so to speak, in the brain. Norepinephrine is a chemical that is very close to dopamine. It works along some of the similar pathways as dopamine. Also, norepinephrine is the chemical that amphetamines stimulate for ADHD patients. And the more norepinephrine that's released in certain parts of the brain, the more activity occurs there. Interesting to notice that if we have too much norepinephrine going into the frontal parts of the brain, the norepinephrine shuts itself down. And this is another reason why the prefrontal area of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, shuts off a lot of times during high uses of amphetamines or other drugs of abuse. This phenomenon is shown here in this particular slide, where overactivation to what's called the beta-1 type receptors in the frontal area of the brain then causes depression. It does this by slowing down those behavioral reward pathways and cognitive pathways that are able to control our mood and our behavior. And here we can see as it goes into the alpha-2 receptor area in the front part of the brain, it activates our attention. Sometimes this is manifested behaviorally by having large dilated pupils that a lot of DRE, drug recognition experts, can recognize as a sign of being on some type of amphetamine or stimulant, whereas very narrow pupillary dilation is associated with opioids or depressants. And here we see norepinephrine going into the amygdala. This results in emotional activation, agitation, irritability, low levels of or high levels of energy, either one. We can surely see these manifestations in stimulant abusers, amphetamine, cocaine, other stimulants. So we can see how the amygdala then, when it's activated by norepinephrine, it causes a lot more paranoia, a lot more awareness of danger in our environment. And if there's not a real danger, we will make one up. So a lot of delusional dangers and paranoid behavior comes from this particular activation.